On the screen, of course, is the book cover of the catalog for that exhibition with that stunning painting by Roald Nasgaard called Night from 1904, one of those moving examples of Solberg's magical capacity to at once be both formally quite severe and quite rich in detail. The exhibition included 120 works from some 60 public and private collections. The catalog text, for those of you who have seen it, will know that it was largely ordered by nationality and only occasionally by theme, but the installation was quite thematic. And just to give you a hint of how it looked, I have three installation shots of three walls with the installation. You can see it was often double hung or even triple hung, as we'll see later on. And just a quick walk across, two works by Fjestad, a tapestry above, a painting below, then another painting by Fjestad, two Canadian artists, J.H. MacDonald above, Lauren Harris below, and then in the corner, two Gallen Kalalas from Finland. A wall of autumn paintings, beginning with Marsden Hartley, and two Canadians again, J.H. MacDonald at top, Franklin Carmichael below, and then four Helmer Oslunds. And this was the exit wall, some of those Searing Suns by Munch, by Arthur Dove, by J.F. Wilhelmsen. But the exhibition wasn't just about shared subject matter across the Atlantic. It was more significantly about how subject matter was accompanied by rethinking of pictorial space. What was at issue here was a kind of crossing over a threshold from descriptive realism to something higher and more intense, something more subjective, so as to make an effect. I think the phrase was used earlier today, landscapes of the soul, whether these were national or individual souls. And in the process of this, the artists essentially rethought their landscape spaces. And of the several themes that the exhibition dealt with, that's really the one I want to focus on here today. And it all began in Europe. It all began in the early 1890s. And to my surprise, for several of the artists and several of the works we'll even be seeing in the next few moments, quite specifically in 1892. And in North America, the beginnings are 15 to 20 years later, that is after the turn of the century. But the particular rationale for doing the exhibition in Toronto, of course, was the historical fact of the immediate and profound influence of some of the Scandinavian landscapes on a young generation of Canadian artists who would subsequently call themselves the Group of Seven. Two members of that group, which went to visited Buffalo, as you also read about in the catalog, visited the Scandinavian art exhibition in Buffalo in early 1913. Now, they were very selective in their looking, and if you've of course seen the exhibition upstairs, you'll know that the exhibition was quite eclectic. But MacDonald and Lauren Harris were particular at what they saw, and they looked especially at the Swede Gustav Fjestad and the Norwegian Harald Solberg, whose paintings they proclaimed to be, and I quote, true souvenirs of the mystic north around which we all revolve. And they provided, or here they found the models for what they felt they must go back to Toronto and to Ontario and do for Canada. And if you don't know it here, the Group of Seven, along with Tom Thomson, who died before the group formally got its name, or after all, there are old masters in Canada. They are first avant-garde, the first painters that we like truly to call Canadian because of how they found an indigenous style that captured something unique about the Canadian North and its wilderness landscape. And you may know that, in fact, an exhibition of the Group of Seven and Tom Thomson has just closed after a very successful run at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London and has subsequently opened in Oslo. But the long-standing myth about the Group of Seven, one that they themselves did not discourage for probably marketing reasons, was that they were not dependent on European styles, that they were born uncontaminated of foreign influences. Instead, their strength was that their character and their stamina, as it were those of Canadian bushwhackers and prospectors, as it was put. And if they needed to learn anything, any new techniques, well, they would just develop them innately out of their deep love for the landscape. The truth, of course, is always more complicated, and the group of seven, or the work of the group of seven, was in its own way, of course, stylistically innovative and independent, but it was also part of a larger story, contaminated by foreign influences. Indeed, they were, whether it was post-impressionism or Art Nouveau or even Fauvism. But I think it was quite specifically the Scandinavians that they looked at, the ones that they focused their attention on, that really showed them fresh ways to look at the landscape, new formal and decorative ways to compose it, and new ways to reshape also the relationship between the viewer and the painting. And it's at least worth remembering that if we as Canadians today tend to look at the paintings of the group of seven as, I got two, didn't I? Anyway, look at them representationally, that's how the Algonquin Park looks, that's how Algoma looks. Well, have to remember that it didn't look that way in 1912. That's how we have learned, or how the group of seven has taught us to look at it. But I'm sorry, this is jumping ahead of me. No. Oh dear. See, it's real easy now. Hey? No, I can do it. So okay, let's see if I can do it. There we are. So let's just look at a few comparisons to establish that family relationship between the Scandinavians of the 1890s and the Canadians after 1912. There was the appeal of fiestads, those heavy Art Nouveau rhythms that characterize his painting and his pointillist paint application, which we find repeated often in Harris and also in J. Yates MacDonald. And a shared predilection for certain times of day, for sunsets, twilights, moonlights, times that were also favored because somehow nature's myriad details were dissolved in terms of larger and more essential forms. For Harris, a lasting influence was that Solberg Winter Night from 1901 on the right-hand side, which was in the exhibition in Buffalo, his odd vision of cold northern peaks with its geometric reductions and cold color schemes. Solberg really showing the Canadians how to levitate his subject matter, or their subject matter, above mere visual fact into the realm of mystical idea. But there were other affinities at play beyond the specific connections that the Buffalo exhibition established. Look at those two paintings, Östlund and Carmichael. Helmer Östlund was not in the Buffalo show, and in any case, Carmichael didn't see it, but both impose on the autumn landscape, another favorite motif. Similar tapestry-like patterns flattening their subject matter decoratively into a kind of Art Nouveau design. And this slide, or this comparison, allows us to introduce the Finnish painter Akseli Gallen-Kallela, who was a member of a circle of nationalistically motivated artists that gathered around Jan Sibelius, who incidentally, Wyndham Lewis, when he was writing about the group of seven in the 1940s, described as a composer of the Canadian bush, and the same Sibelius that Glenn Gould would later call a Canadian composer. The problem shared on both sides of the Atlantic went something like this. When the Scandinavians, often inspired by a new sense of nationalism and in search of an accompanying transcendent subject matter, came back north at the end of the 1880s, they discovered that the impressionistic techniques that they had developed while studying in France, learning how to, in a sense, learning their styles in the softer and light and atmosphere around Paris, that those techniques didn't work when they got back north. Something was wrong if you tried to paint the north and it turned out still to look like the Ile-de-France. The light in the north was harsher, the wilderness was too chaotic for eyes that had been trained in southern cultivated landscapes. The Scandinavians, of course, applying newer post-impressionist models, developed the stylistic means to which to unlock their own landscape, to see it and depict it more boldly, more grandly, and that's what the Canadians picked up on in Buffalo. that the Scandinavians could offer a younger generation of Canadians decorative keys that could open up to fresh visions, open them up to fresh visions of their northern nature at a moment when they'd come to realize that the other models around, English, French, or Dutch, were no longer adequate. But the Scandinavian-Canadian connection was only one aspect of a larger orientation of spiritualized landscape painting in Northern Europe. And this is the painting that got my thinking going towards the larger story, this relatively bizarre painting relief by the Dane Jens Ferdinand Willumsen. And alas, we have to ignore the side panels for the moment because they're too long and too interesting a discussion, because they are indeed fascinating. But it's okay, because when Willumsen first conceived the painting, and when he first exhibited it at the Champ de Mars in Paris, it was shown as a pure landscape. The reliefs he only added later when he wanted to reinforce with more iconographic heft all the weight of meaning that he had wanted the landscape to convey to us. So let's just focus on the landscape, on that strange, panoramic, oddly abstracted composite view of a remote northern mountainous region. What's interesting is how we see it from overhead, as if we were suspended in midair with no physical entry point, nowhere to place our feet. This may not seem strange today when these views, we all have mountains we've all had from outside our airplane window, but in 1892 it was really quite remarkable, not only for its point of view, but because this was probably the first true mountain picture for a long time. Mountain subject matter had more or less been banished from European paintings since sometime in the mid-19th century, except for a few holdouts in Switzerland, but they don't count, as if the realists and the impressionists needed to keep their eyes strictly earthbound. Willumsen was the first to rediscover mountains in this sense, and even the mountains of monumental mountain painters like Solberg and the Swiss Ferdinand Hodler only got there after the turn of the century. But when Hodler did rediscover his own Swiss mountains, he took a mystical attitude towards them, much like Willumsen's, severing them from their gravitational anchor and from peripheral reference points. It's as if we are seeing them through a kind of telephoto lens, their spatial location made ambiguous by the absence of aerial perspective in the peaks themselves. And here, in this painting, of course, they rise behind a hazy and mysterious dew mist. And this is just how mountains would look for many other artists over the next decade or so, and I will just quickly run through other iterations. Mountain peaks isolated from their earthly roots in order to draw our eyes upwards as into seats of transcendent mystery. Hodler in Switzerland, Varley in the Rockies of Canada. Hodler again, and I know that the Marsden Hartleys from Mexico, but let's not be picky. And just for good measure, let's add the mystical American painter Augustus Tack into the mix, and of course there are many, many more examples that we could follow through. We might say that if the artists we're talking about of the 90s came from Barbizon or Impressionist backgrounds, as indeed the Canadians did in 1912, they, as symbolist landscape painters, posed themselves the problem of how to change the experiential point of view of their viewers, how to direct our eyes in new directions. Usually it is upwards or downwards, but rarely into the middle ground, like this Barbizon Rousseau or that Impressionist Caillebotte. Rarely do they give us composition that allow us to wander in and through the picture, stepping into the foreground and sauntering about in middle ground and taking our comfortable place there. Even when such an entry seems to be offered, as this Hodler painting from 1892, somehow it isn't. There's no sauntering here. Before we can even step onto the road, it's down the center, perspectival recession rushes us on, past the falling autumn leaves towards the near infinity of the last reds of the setting sun, all of it weighty with symbolic meaning. So where do we stand as viewers? Where are we? It used to be that when artists wanted us wanted to pull us into the embrace of transcendental experience. They did via a surrogate figure. A surrogate figure set inside the depicted landscape through which we made our communication, whether it was a monk on a seashore, or men gazing at the moon, or this woman before the setting sun from 1818. Friedrich, of course, was an artist largely forgotten by the end of the 19th century and was only discovered in the early 1890s, which is surely no coincidence. But there she is, and where has she gone in the Caspar David Friedrich? I mean, in the Hodler. Now, if you look closely, and I doubt if the slide will allow you to do that, but somewhere down the middle of the pathway, there is her ghostly presence. And indeed, if we look at the sketch for the painting, there she is. And at some point, Hodler decided that to paint her out, decided to make her, or shall we say, make her step back out of the picture and into our shoes, with the consequence that our vision, our symbolist vision of transcendent experience is no longer mediated, but direct. And it surely is no coincidence. Surely is no coincidence that in Finland, in the same year, in 1892, Gallen-Kallela simultaneously made a similar decision. This painting was originally planned to include figures, at least one of which was the nymph playing a harp, and in the painting apparently she is also just visible, painted over in the lower right. So he'd originally conceived his painting as a more traditional literary figurative allegory. But like Hodler, the same year, he decided that that was no longer satisfactory. It was an outmoded solution. So instead, he drew those 5 parallel golden strings representing the strings of a harp vertically from top to bottom down the middle of the picture plane, a formal device that subverts its otherwise realistic conception. Anyway, in any case, 2 demonstrations of how the human figure was largely banished from much northern symbolist landscape paintings. No, that was what I wanted. That was good. In any case, there are other observations to be made about our relationship to the symbolist landscape. Here we have a romantic painting on the left-hand side by Gustave Doré, and on the right-hand side, Prince Eugene's Forest, again 1892. As you'll see, Doré uses a fairly standard romantic device for ameliorating forest, the terrors of the forest, by opening up the foreground and driving a continuous broad pathway down the middle of the picture, releasing us into sunlit plains beyond. Now, Prince Eugene's taken another tack. It's as if when we're walking down the open road towards our destination, suddenly he decides that's not where he wants us to go, and instead he makes us turn 90 degrees to face the forest wall itself in its confused and impenetrable maze, deep and dark and mysterious. If the light of the setting sun is back there somewhere, it's more menacing than it's promising. So, if one compositional mode of northern symbolist landscape painting was to make us look upwards at the unattainable, here it's to block access by the dense maze of the forest. A variation of this is to draw across the picture plane a screen of trees as a compositional barrier to define a threshold between spaces that are discontinuous, both physically and psychologically. So these 2 Finnish paintings, Gallen-Kallela and Pekka Halonen. And if you try to enter the Gallen-Kallela, for example, there's no point of entry here. There's no foreground path, no continuous transition from foreground to middle ground to the distant background. If there's a foreground, it's confused, it's precariously steep, it's slippery, and if we were to scramble up it, we don't know what's on the other side, probably a deep falling off. So in effect, the tree screen divides the picture into 2 distinct and spatially disconnected parts, a compacted physically tangible foreground that's pressed up close in claustrophobically and large scale, and a distant panoramic more kind of macrocosm for purely imaginary exploration. And again, this is also a theme that we can follow through numerous iterations. And even if we compare Tom Thomson and see the likeness, there's no way Tom Thomson could have known about Gallen-Kallela or even seen a reproduction in the slides. So we are talking about affinities and family relations rather than direct influence. Or this is another soul bear that was included in the Scandinavian exhibition in Buffalo, and another composition that impressed Lauren Harris, who used it in several paintings. And never mind, soul bear's compatriot, Edvard Munch, or Mondrian's woods near Erle, same kind of almost liquid or palette. Or let's stop for a moment, just another moment, and look at these two. We already seen how soul bear was a potent model for Harris, and here's another specific use of it. We note how soul bear has pulled aside the gnarled and twisted black trees in the foreground, like opening a kind of stage curtain to reveal a dazzling white and blue moonlit vision of the simplified contours of the mountains that are arranged conveniently with a little peak in the center that points up at the single star. A composition that Harris adapted many, many times in this contrast of foreground detail to distant, abstracted, monumentalized forms, reconfirming the compositional difference between foreground and background with little attention to middle ground. And just to prove I'm not making this up, here is how soul bear himself described his own composition. He says, "It is precisely the opposition between the calm and the grandeur and the power of the mountains and the broken nature of the foreground plain, strewn with twisted pieces of dead wood, amongst which rises a few solitary tree trunks as a physical barrier. Far beyond these, lofty architectural forms rise austerely and peacefully as symbols of transcendent experience." So near and far. So it appears that if we can juxtapose near and far in the same picture, we can also separate them out, either by looking up at the mountain peaks or burrowing only downwards into the jumble of tree stumps or dead wood or rocks or streams. These intimate views with their own monumental stature. And again, a few iterations of that, and we could, of course, to these we could add the Annabobear Glacier Lake from up in the exhibition, which I think we've seen already twice this morning. And just to reintroduce the J.H. MacDonald in the lower left corner. Finally, let us take note of Northern Symbolist Landscape's predilection for symmetry, as it was practiced here in the example of Hodler and Harris. For Hodler, symmetry was a reflection of the underlying harmony of all creation and made manifest in simple frontal compositions that make us feel as if, quote, a spiritual skeleton of transcendent order lies beneath the transient material surface of things. I'll consider that the same order of symmetry applies to Hodler's panoramic views of Lake Geneva. Here he assembles in the painting in the upper left his subject matter into grand oval patterns that operate both in the depth of the landscape and on the surface patterns, including the clouds up above. And for good measure, let us also throw into the pot Eugene Janssen's Nocturne as an overview of a Stockholm night as a kind of parallel compositional structure. And in later views, like the one in the upper left, Hodler draws out his oval forms until they're stretched into severe horizontal bands crossing the picture surface with a calm and eternal serenity, a kind of flattening out of the natural elements that Hodler by then had come to associate with the finality of death. And in the Netherlands, we find Mondrian doing the same thing. On the screen is a sunset on the sea subject from 1909 that, despite its pointless technique, closely parallels the accompanying Hodler. the Netherlands may not have had much wilderness, but here on the edge of the sea, Mondrian discovered something comparable, nature in her endless breadth outside man's intervention and reduced to her most essential forms. And lastly, let us throw in this painting by Emily Carr from the west coast of Canada. If Carr's spontaneous and flowing technique has often been called expressionist, in the same way its abstract sweep shows her really belonging securely within the tradition of Northern Symbolist landscape, and perhaps she completes the line of it. And I use the word abstract because what we've been observing, as in the late Hodler, as in the late Mondrian paintings, is something that approaches pure abstraction. It was, of course, rare that Northern Symbolist landscape painters ever did cross that threshold into pure abstraction, except, of course, for Mondrian, but that's a story that we well know. And also, surprisingly, Lawrence Harris, who as late as 1930, writing to Emily Carr on the West Coast after he'd been traveling Europe, looking or exposing himself to as much abstract painting as he could get to see, complaining to or maintaining to Emily Carr that Canadian artists can never abandon the life and the forms of nature. That was in 1930, but what have we here? But that's another story. Thank you.